to today's ACM Learning webinar. This webcast is a part of ACM's commitment to lifelong learning and serving the over 100,000 computing professionals and students who are the members of the ACM. I'm Peter Aiken, the founding director of Data Blueprint and associate professor of information systems at Virginia Commonwealth University. I'm also a member of SIG-MIS. I've been active in the field of data management for more than 30 years as a practicing consultant, author, and researcher. You can find my full biography in the presenter window of your console. Next slide up, there we go. ACM offers educational and professional development resources that bolster skills and enhance career opportunities. Our members stay competitive in a constantly changing world of computing with a range of ACM Learning Center resources at learning.acm.org. It's a pretty easy one to remember, so hopefully you won't forget it. On that, I use it constantly. You can see some of the highlights on your screen if I can get that one slide to push on there. ACM recognizes the role of computing in driving the innovations that sustain competitiveness in a global environment. ACM provides timely computing information published by the ACM, including the communications of the ACM and Q magazines. Access to the ACM Digital Library, the world's most comprehensive database of computing literature, and international conferences that draw leading experts on a broad range of computing topics. They also offer support and education research, including curriculum development, teacher training, the ACM Turing and ACM Infosys Foundation Awards. ACM enables its members to solve critical problems using new technology that enriches our lives and advances our society in the digital age. Before we get started, I'd like to mention a few housekeeping items shown on the slide in front of you. In the top right-hand corner of the slide area on your screen, there's a button that will allow you to enlarge the slides. You may also enlarge the slides at any time by dragging the corner of the slide window. The slides will automatically advance throughout the event. During this presentation, you can minimize the slide area, QA, and bio screens using the buttons at the bottom panel. You can also use a number of widgets also found on the bottom panel, including Facebook, Twitter, Wikipedia, and a resource list where you can get a copy of the slides. If you're experiencing problems with our web interface, please refresh your console by pressing the F5 key in Windows and Command R if you're on a Macintosh. Refresh your browser if you're on a mobile device, or close and relaunch the presentation. You can also visit the webcast help guide by clicking on the Help widget in the slide window. To control the volume, please adjust the master volume on your computer. At the end of our presentation, we will have time for questions, and we hope you have several. If you think of a question during the presentation, please go ahead and type it in the Q&A box and click on the Submit button. You do not need to wait until the end of the presentation to begin submitting the questions. You may also use the Q&A box and the survey at the end to suggest topics for future webinars. At the end of the presentation, you'll see a survey URL on the final slide. Please do take a minute to fill out the survey and help us to improve the webinars. This session is being recorded and will be archived. You'll receive an automatic email notification when it is available, or you can check learning.acm.org in a few days for updates. ACM recognizes the role of wrong page there, sorry guys. Hang on. There we go. All right, here we go now for Talkback. And what we want you guys to do, of course, is keep involved socially. You can also use Facebook and Twitter widgets at the bottom panel to share the presentation link with your friends. I'm sure you're going to find it's one of the most fascinating you've seen. And tweet comments and questions using the hashtag #ACMWebinarBI. We'll be watching for your tweets, and if we do get them, we'll toss them into the Q&A as well. Today's presentation is the marriage of BI and big data. Business Unintelligence by Barry Devlin. Barry is among the foremost authorities on business insight and one of the founders of data warehousing, having published the first architectural paper on the topic back in 1988. Seems like a long time, doesn't it, Barry? With over 30 years of IT experience, including 20 years as an IBM distinguished engineer, he is a widely respected analyst, consultant, lecturer, and author of the seminal book, Data Warehouse from Architecture to Implementation. He has also written numerous white papers, blogs, et cetera, et cetera. His latest book, Business Unintelligence, Insight and Innovation Beyond Analytics and Big Data, was published last year. Barry is the founder and principal of 9 Site Consulting and specializes in human, organizational, and IT implications of deep business insight solutions in all technology environments. Barry lives in Cape Town, South Africa, but he operates worldwide. Barry, we're so pleased you could join us today, and we'll let you roll over and get started.
Peter, thank you so much. Thank you also for pointing out my age and how long I've been in this business. I typically just refer to myself these days as the illegitimate grandfather of data warehousing, and that sort of gets us through the intros. Today I want to talk about BI and big data and their marriage, and I'd like to start, I'm going to do it in the form of 3 questions. And the first question that I'm going to start with is about the business side, the real difference that big data makes for business. We can't have too many presentations these days without a few Dilbert cartoons, and this one I'm thinking is interesting because it really talks about the question of quantity versus quality, which I think is something we're all going to have to deal with in terms of this big data. But let's get going and look at the more business side of the environment. So big data. I'm not going to do the definition, the 3 V's or the 6 V's or whatever number of V's you want to have. I just want to look a little bit in the past and say where this big data and big data analytics emerged was from business and with the social media and weblogs that were being created, particularly in the internet organizations in the big web behemoth that we're all very familiar with today. It was about understanding and tracking sentiment. It was about getting real-time insight into and influence on website activities. And if you look at that, you can begin to think, well, it's sort of a bit like BI, trying to understand the basic analytics of what do you think, how do you react, what's the typical sort of past looking in the mirror that BI's done, just on a different or a new data source. The other side of it, the real-time insight into website activities and trying to influence them. Why did you abandon your cart? What would you most likely buy if I tried to cross-sell you something or upsell you something? That's really very closely related to deep real-time analytics and the old operational BI that we talked about for a long time. And there's an interesting point here, operational integration, that we're going to come back to as we go through this presentation. This thought that there's a very great interest in real time. And I think that becomes even more obvious on the next slide, where we're talking about the Internet of Things. And yeah, the Internet of Things it's impossible to avoid. In 2014, every presentation has to talk about it. From my point of view, the Internet of Things adds a new urgency for positioning big data. It also gives us another view into what's going on. If we think about it in two ways from a business point of view, one is that it extends existing processes. So one of the things you'll see throughout the Internet of Things is new micromanagement of supply chains, extension of the supply chains all the way to the consumer. I show a picture here of a internet-connected refrigerator. The idea that you don't have to worry about whether you're going to run out of milk or not. The refrigerator will know and automatically order it for you. The interesting thing, of course, some of you may have heard, is already we've had the first refrigerator, internet-connected refrigerator being hacked. Not sure why people would want to hack into my refrigerator, but hey, you'd never know what's going on here. So this is one sense where we're extending existing processes. It's, if you like, doing more of the same. But the other thing, and the other point perhaps more interesting, is creating completely new business models, often depending on analytics. So we have the idea, and I'm sure you know of it, the motor insurance, moving from an idea where we're actually doing actuarial work and trying to predict risk and manage risk, to encouragement of better driving, prevention of accidents. And there's some interesting things going on there in terms of how we use the data and how the data is being used for something different than it was originally intended for. Again, something which we need to take care of, and I'll come back to towards the end of this presentation. Another area where we see this very clearly change in the way of doing business is in hospital care. The idea that we move from bringing people into emergency rooms when they get ill to ongoing health monitoring through the wearable devices that we've seen all over the internet in the last year or so. And as you see from the photograph here, it's not only about bringing the people into hospital. You can also monitor on an ongoing basis the health and the fitness of your pets. So this is indeed a very new way of doing business and indeed of living. And this is a major change that we have to take care of. Now, I've been thinking about some of these things, but if you look at this in a broader sense, I'm starting to talk about what I call the BizTech ecosystem to reflect the complexity of the business and the information environment and the process environment that I've just been talking about. So this slide is trying to show that there are a number of inputs, and of course there are more than 3 inputs and 1 output, but it's trying to summarize it in a digestible manner. On one hand, we have the idea that there is all of this externally sourced information, which we've been talking about so far with the Internet of Things, information in an abundance and a variety which we have never had before and which we are using in ways we've never used before. Both that externally sourced information and the technology, the mobile technology and so on, is leading to a completely different way of customer interaction, a completely new level of technical savvy among customers and people who are interacting with businesses. So we have to take into account that we are coming with a lot of information from the smartphones and the mobile devices of the world. And we're also in a world that has been going on, this has been going on for a few years now, of extreme flexibility in the marketplace, extreme uncertainty, a huge level of competition. All of these drivers, I believe, forcing us to look at a new way of bringing business and information technology together, integrating them much more closely than they've ever been integrated before in order to enable the speed, the real-time decision-making, the appropriate action, the taking into account of all of the things we need to look at in order to understand what we need to do next, where we need to go next, what's the long-term strategy, what's the medium-term implications, etc., etc. And that's why I call it the BizTech ecosystem, because I really do believe that what we're talking about here is an environment where business and information technology actually have to work in symbiosis. They have to be totally dependent upon one another. IT drives business, business drives technology in a tight loop. And this is a very important concept as we start thinking about, as we will in a couple of moments, when we start thinking about what the architecture and the IT systems that we need in order to take advantage of all this information, to react to the market as it changes, to support customers as they come in increasingly interactive ways with the right speed of decisions and appropriate action. So that's where, if you like, the excitement is. But I'd like to remind you, of course, that there's also the traditional business data. The traditional business data that we've been collecting, creating, managing, and using in a structured and regulated way since the 60s in the IT systems that we built way back then. So this is what I call process-mediated data. And I call it that because from this point of view, it is created and managed through the processes that we define as part of the business. So unlike big data, unlike the data from the Internet of Things, which we have very little control over, the structure, the content, the rate at which it arrives, process-mediated data is mediated by our own processes, and therefore we have a lot more control over it. It's also the legal basis of business. It is the stuff that says this was a transaction, this is a customer, and so on. So this is a very interesting distinction between traditional business data, process-mediated data as I call it, and the big data and analytics data, which is gathered from unreliable sources. So the business value of big data really does depend on linking it to the traditional business processes. And we're seeing that more and more as our understanding of the Internet of Things and as our understanding of big data grows as we get more familiar with it. So that's, in a nutshell, very different way of doing business because of the volumes of information, because of the types of information, because of the mobile users, because of the instant connectivity. All of these things change business entirely. And this is what we have to take account of and move into as we start talking about the next question that I want to deal with, which is the actual how do we marry big data and BI if we have to look at this BizTech ecosystem. And I think that the middle panel of this cartoon is interesting, right? Technically, all data isn't necessary because our decisions are always based on flawed logic anyway. And I'm highlighting that because one of the things that I really deal with in my book, in Business Unintelligence, is that when we look at logic, when we look at business decisions and try to think about them as logic, we're perhaps not entirely on the right path. Sometimes I say we're entirely on the wrong path. We'll come back to that again a little later. But keep it in mind, sometimes we're doing something which is not necessarily logical, but we certainly have a lot more data and information to play with. Okay, so how are we going to marry big data and BI? So in order to do that, I need to drop back into the past, full 30 years, as Peter sort of mentioned earlier, and talk a little bit about where we came from. So process-mediated data, I've mentioned already. That is the core of business intelligence, and it comes from and comes through this layered data warehouse architecture that I introduced with a colleague, Paul Murphy, back in 1988 through the IBM Systems Journal. The multicolored picture in the background was published in that journal article way back in 1988 and was based on work that we did in the mid-'80s within IBM. The picture to the right of it is a more schematic view of what was going on, a little bit more detail, a little more depth, but the characteristics are the same. Tactical decision-making based on reconciled data. In other words, we were talking about how to get consistency. Way back then, those of you who may remember, I do, consistency and single versions of the truth were very important. That's what was driving a lot of this architecture. Very important to remember that. In order to do that, we had an architecture which separated operational and informational needs. It separated the data into vertical and horizontal segments that we managed separately. We had unidirectional data flow, which is always very good for data management. And we were focused entirely on process-mediated data. In fact, we didn't know what big data was. Or let's actually be honest, we knew what big data was, but it was probably a couple of gigs back then. And it was all process-mediated. So when we think about this particular architecture, you'll see that there's some challenges. One is, how do we get the data to flow through it quickly enough? How do we get it over this operational informational divide? How do we manage the changes and the flexibility that we need in a new architecture if we've got all these layers? How do we bring in the fact that it's not really a unidirectional data flow? It's actually bidirectional. So all of this thinking was going on in my head about 4 or 5 years ago when I started looking at this and said, we have to get away from this layered architecture. And the picture that I started to draw, well, yeah, it sort of maybe looks a little bit like a layered architecture, but it's rather different. And I'm trying to take your mind into what I might call 3 logical or conceptual thinking spaces of information, process, and people. So this is a conceptual architecture. The conceptual architecture, it's a foundation for the cooperation that I mentioned in the BizTech ecosystem between business and IT. A foundation that's trying to say this is simple enough for business people to get their heads around and to be able to discuss. And as I'll show in the next slide, it's deep enough for IT people to talk about it a little bit more. It's called IDEAL because I like to do acronyms. I used to work for IBM, and you know every IBM thing has to be at least a 3-letter acronym. This is a 5-letter acronym. Integrated, distributed, emergent, adaptive, and latent. Well, integrated because it has to integrate information from all the different parts of the business. It has to integrate processes. It has to integrate information in processes. It must be distributed across all the places where the information lives and where all the processes run. It has to be emergent and adaptive because we do not know how this system is going to evolve and how it's going to emerge. And we're talking here about mathematical chaos and some of the aspects of chaos theory. And latent means hidden in this case. Hidden because, you know what? This is not the way we build the architecture. It's actually the foundation behind what we're going to build, the conceptual level of what we want to build. And I also want you to look at it and read it as a story that says people process information, because that's what it's about. It's about how do people process information. So that's it at one level, at a very high level, a conceptual architecture. Let me show you just one more piece of depth of this before I move on. And that's to just show you that there is structure within each of these thinking spaces. I'll just show you the information space. Each of these spaces has 3 axes. Each axis represents some aspect of the way information, in this case, or process in the other case, the way that information has to be thought about. Those of you who've played with data warehouses and business intelligence over the years, if you look along the x-axis, you'll see words that will probably remind you of the process that you go through as you move from real-time operational data into data warehouses and data marts and archive and so on and so forth. And what I'm saying there, for example, is that axis represents this dichotomy, this paradox that we always have to deal with between timeliness and consistency whenever we're dealing with information in the real world. The axis, let me call it the y-axis, going back into the slide, is about structure and context. And you'll probably imagine there words like structured and unstructured and semi-structured. This is trying to get this idea that structure and context within information are also deeply interrelated and deeply codependent. And then the Z or Z axis, reliance and usage, one that is often ignored and often very poorly handled, really trying to deal with this idea of where do we get data from, how far can we rely upon it, and where can we use it. And it's very different depending on its provenance. So this particular 3-dimensional view is, the idea of it is to give us the possibility to break data or information into different blocks or into different categories that we can then begin to play with. Now I'm going to jump pretty much instantly to the logical architecture. We've been dealing with conceptual. I want to deal a little bit with logical architecture now. So this is at least part of this logical real architecture. And just as I was looking at these slides before we came on, I recognized that I haven't put on the slides what real stands for. So let me tell you, it's realistic, it's extensible, it's actionable, and it's labile. And labile is just another word for flexible. But REAF doesn't work as well as REAL. Excuse me. So let's just take a look briefly at this logical architecture, which is about how do I actually build an architecture that would support the types, the breadth of information that we have in the world today, and the demands to handle it in real time. I'm going to deal with it in 2 parts. First of all, let's look at there's blue stuff and there's brown stuff. The blue stuff is around the data and the information, and the brown stuff is around process. You'll notice there's no people in this architecture because it's still not possible for us in IT to implement people in an architectural sense or in software, but it's coming. So here at the moment, let's look at the two parts. I'm showing the process here that allows us to get from the stuff that happens in the real world, the measures, the events, the messages, that turns them into transactions, that brings them into the data stores of the organization, that creates and assimilates the information, brings it together, mixes and matches it, and finally makes it available to users through virtualized access that I call reification. And the idea here is that the data flows as fast as needed. It flows through these different information pillars as quickly as is needed. It's reconciled only when necessary. We try to avoid unnecessary storage or transformations of data. And one of the ideas here is that we're trying to get away from these layers. If I look at these pillars, these three information pillars, and there could be many more, but at this level, at this high-level view, I'm suggesting that there are three pillars. There is machine-generated data on the left, there's process-mediated data in the middle, and human-sourced information on the right. Now, we've mentioned process-mediated data before, and you'll see that it sort of spans both the transactional data and the BI data at the top. I'll show you a little bit more on the next slide. And the idea is each of these pillars is the technology that you need. And I believe, for example, that process-mediated data is going to be most logically and most reasonably implemented in a relational environment for the foreseeable future. Personally, I don't care what's underneath that relational model, whether it's Hadoop or whether it's an MPP, old-fashioned MPP database, but it needs to be the relational model because the process-mediated data needs to be relational. It needs to be related to one another, and it's being related, and its relatedness is one of its most important properties. The machine-generated data, think of it broadly as the Internet of Things, but also stuff coming from ATMs and switches in telco networks. Could that be relational? Yes, I've seen that at medium levels of speed and medium sizes, relational can still work, but probably no SQL type of technology, perhaps even Hadoop. Streaming technology is a likely set of technologies over in that left-hand pillar. If I go to the human-sourced information being the videos, the tweets, all of the stuff from the social network, then I'm probably thinking it's Hadoop and it's a lot of those more modern types of environments. So you can see here we're trying to create a view that the process that is the layered piece, but the information is pillars. But there is a piece of information that I want to point out to you, and I'm going to come back to it in the next section, of context setting information. And that is part of the process and part of the key of integrating sources and stores, integrating it so that it is made into a set of information that actually works together. So keep that in mind, context setting information, or if you prefer an acronym, CSI for short. So let me just give you one more picture of this environment. So a mapping from these pillars onto today's BI and analytic tools. And this is a very broad mapping. But the idea here is that I just want to show you that this is not all pie in the sky. So the process-mediated data, that traditional computing, that data entry, the cleansing processes, the relationship to relational databases, and the online transaction processing systems, the enterprise data warehouse, our standard BI, data marts, and so on, all fit into that middle pillar. And then operational analytics and predictive analytics can be spread across the other two pillars, and indeed the middle pillar where necessary in order to make that all fit together. Okay, so I know that I've really sped through a fairly complex set of architecture in about 4 slides. And what I really, at this stage, just want to say to you is that well, this is the advertising break, right? This is where I want to say to you, this is all available and all explained in a lot more depth in this book, Business Unintelligence. And some of the words here, I think, I just want to emphasize a little bit while you look at this cover and think, why is there a leaf growing out of a root? And I want you to think of maybe there's rationality and there's things beyond rationality. Maybe there's a logic of process, some of which is predefined, but some of which has to emerge. There's this thought that we have to move through information and knowledge to meaning. I want you to think about reason, inspiration, emotion, intention, collaboration, competition, all of that stuff, because what we're moving into, and I'll come back to this a little more in the final part of this presentation, is an environment where the human aspect is becoming much more important. In fact, I will say it is becoming more important than the technology aspect and more than the IT aspect. And that's very important as we move forward. Even though we need an architecture, even though the book, spends a lot of time talking about this architecture, it really comes back at the end to talk about business unintelligence, the stuff that's beyond intelligence. It's available on Amazon. It's available from the publisher's website. It's available in ebook. It's available in hard copy. I'm going to move on and leave our sponsors there. Let's move to part 3 of this presentation. So the closing question that I want to put in front of you is, what are the dangers in the marriage of BI and big data? And again, you'll probably see, as I've chosen this Dilbert cartoon, that dealing of personal information and the use of personal information, and indeed the use of information in general, is what I want to talk about. But in order to talk about that, I just want to, move into a little bit and talk about data, information, knowledge, and meaning. And those of you who've been around a while know that means I probably need to start talking about metadata. So there's an interesting thought. I want to suggest to you that we want to stop using the word metadata because it is 2 4-letter words. It's not data, it's information. It's not just about data, it's about all the stuff. It's about the processes, it's about the people, it's about everything. And for most people, including IT, it's indistinguishable from business information. And I have a question here of the most expensive metadata error in history, just to give you something to pause and think about. And I will actually show you what that was. It was the Mars Climate Orbiter, which crashed into the surface of Mars in 1999 at a cost of $325 million. That's pretty expensive for a metadata error. And some of you may know, but the reason that it crashed was that the ground systems were using the imperial system of force and measurements, whereas the satellite itself was using the metric system, or vice versa. It doesn't really matter. The fact is, when you don't know you're doing a translation between two systems, things go horribly wrong. And there's another reason why metadata is, I think, on the way out. And that's thanks to our friends in the NSA, who have popularized and repurposed metadata by saying it's not information, or it's not personal information, so we can collect. And I think that's very ironic. Those of us who've spent many years trying to promote metadata as information now finally found that it's been taken away from us. And it's one of the reasons why I've started using this idea of context-setting information, because metadata is about context. So let me again go back a little bit in the past and mention a person that you probably have heard of and that you've used his pyramid many times, the data, information, knowledge, wisdom pyramid, Russell Ackoff. He came up with this idea back in 1989. And one of the things that I did in this book was to have a look at this idea of data, information, knowledge, and wisdom. And I've come to the conclusion that we need a different way of looking at it. And I call this the M3, or modern meaning model. And the idea here is to look at the relationships between information, knowledge, and meaning. I didn't feel competent to bring in wisdom because I don't really feel old enough yet to be wise. So down at the bottom of this diagram, you'll see information. You'll also see data stuck in there. And I want just to make this point that as far as I'm concerned, data is simply information that's optimized for computers. In this sense, information precedes data. Conceptually, you have to know what you're looking for, that's information, before you start gathering or creating data. And although you may gather the data and then take information out of it, in fact, at some conceptual level, we go the other way. And that's important to remember because that gives us the relationship between modeling and interpreting information and data. It gives us the ability to think about these transitions and how we might use them. And how then we can move from information, which is the physical, objective storage of stuff on our computers, to knowledge, which resides in our minds. This is the mental locus, and it talks about explicit knowledge and tacit knowledge, and that intersection of what we keep in our minds and how it's somewhat different from information. And by the way, I think that means, to me at least, that this idea of knowledge management is actually quite nonsensical, because actually most of what people talk about in knowledge management is actually information management. And then there's the top level, and that really takes us into the idea that we're looking at meaning, the stories that we tell ourselves. Because when we do BI, it's all very well having the information. It's all very well even having knowledge about what's going on there. But the real question is, what is the story we're going to make up about it? And at the core and at the heart of all this is context setting information and what we used to call metadata. So let me just briefly position that context setting information in this model, in this M3 model, which describes in physical form everything that is and does in terms of the environment, in terms of the big data environment, in terms of BI. It is the background to everything. You sort of, if you think about it, every piece of information adds context to something else. And all information context setting to a greater or lesser extent. So this will take us much more deeply than I could go in this presentation, but it takes us to consider the human and social dimension of decision making. The idea that we have now to take into account gut feel, intent, interactions. We need to move from Rodin's thinker to Rodin's kiss. We need to take into account the neurobiology that goes on within the human mind, in the human brain, in terms of how does it actually work, and begin to recognize that rationality is only one part of what we do. Emotional state plays an important role in how we make decisions. And there's lots of examples that you can find in the literature, which can show you that not only do we use rationality and we use limited or bounded rationality, but gut feel is also an important part of our decision making and can play an important role and can even be more effective than rationality in some sorts of decision making. We've started to recognize this fact when we start doing social networking and social media analysis. But what I wanted you to try to think about is the fact that it also applies within the business, to the decisions we take within the business, the decision makers, the decision team. We are social animals, and business at the end of the day is a social enterprise. We've often heard that innovation is team-based. That's another social activity. So all of this together, and I'm telling you very quickly, is that the bottom line here is that we can do our layers of our information and our process. But at the end of the day, we have to take account of what goes on in the human mind. The last part of this presentation, I do want to focus on dangers. I've got 4 or 5 slides to go, and I want to move rather quickly into them. So let's focus on the dangers, and you can imagine that the dangers, probably from what I've said, you can imagine that I'm thinking about what we do around privacy, what we do around the uses of information. And I believe that we're into very dangerous territory here. The next 4 slides are going to give you some examples and some things to think about, and hopefully some things to keep you awake at night. So here is some analysis of the data broker industry. particularly in the US, which is now gathering thousands of measurable attributes about consumers, or I prefer to use the word people, and creating marketing lists. And I give you here some examples of marketing lists, and you may be thinking, are they really good lists that you want to publicize and to put out there in the blog sphere or in the business internet as possible mailing lists? The Office Max letter here, I don't know if you can see it on your slides, but in the address field there is daughter killed in car crash. So you may ask why Office Max might have been interested in that information, what it was doing on the envelope. It's crazy stuff here. And this is just a small example, but there is a very interesting, and I've given you the link here, a very interesting document which comes from Pam Dixon of the World Privacy Forum before the Senate Committee in December of last year, showing how scoring can be used to target market people, but also discriminate against them. This is serious stuff. This is not what we mean by freedom. Let's go a little deeper. We may think about the Internet of Things as data snatchers. Here is an example, and I again give you the link of an LG television in the UK. This guy wondered why on this TV how the ads came up. You'll see there's an ad for more stockpot recipes there in the bottom left, and he wondered how those recipes were chosen. And being a bit of a hacker, he went in and had a look at the data stream coming out of this internet-connected or smart TV. And you'll see that the TV is actually sending information, unencrypted information, plain text information, back back into the internet. And in fact, it's also sending back the names of files that are accessed on thumbsticks that are plugged into the TV. Crazy stuff, data snatching, and no real control over it. Let's have a look at what I call excuse me, the invasion of the information snatchers. This is a patent from Verizon. The idea here is that a device like a games device or a content delivery device placed on your TV is actually creating ambient action, is collecting ambient action information from what's going on in the room in front of it. And the idea, as you can see in this workflow, is that you detect the ambient action performed by a user during the presentation of the program, you identify an advertisement that would be associated with that action, and then you present the identified advertisement during the advertisement break. So here you can see something that might, and I've chosen a fairly tame version of what might be going on the sofa in front of the TV, and of course then we can advertise the right particular product in that instance. So this is an invasion of information snatchers right into the living room, and Verizon are not the only ones thinking about this in terms of patents. And we can go further. Some of you may have seen this article in the New York Times in November of last year, where then essentially algorithms can identify emotional state based on your face. So this, as you can imagine, is getting a lot of interest among the security people and the NSA and so on and so forth. So now we're getting to read thoughts. This is scary stuff to me, folks. I mean, I'm on a little soapbox here and I need to wind up. But to be absolutely honest, these are the sort of things we're enabling. And this is the sort of stuff that we, as data scientists, as IT experts, as computer scientists, whatever we consider ourselves to be, this is the sort of stuff we need to think about, the social, the psychological, and the political, and the implications of this. Because what we're doing here, in my view, is destroying democracy. So let me wrap up. Let me wrap up with a couple of things. First, I want to tell you, I've told you that big data extends BI and operations. It's faster, it's future, it's statistical. It's the driving force of the BizTech ecosystem, and that's really changing the way that we do business and indeed the way that we live our lives. I've told you about business unintelligence as a new model, as a new architecture, described in much more detail in my book, and it consists of an ideal or conceptual architecture and a real or logical architecture. And probably the most important point to take home at this stage is that it is inclusive of all information and data that you can think of, and indeed all processes. It is also, the third point that I wanted to bring home to you was that what I see here is an erosion of privacy, an end of anonymity, which has very significant consequences if we continue along the path we're on. And that path, I believe, will lead us eventually to the death of democracy. You may have different views, and I'd love to have a conversation with you via Twitter or via my blogs or whatever, but please join in here. This is very important. The picture I show, the last point I want to make, those of you who recognize it may see Pandora's box. And Pandora's box, the story of Pandora's box was that the gods gave Pandora this box with the admonition that she should not open it, which is a crazy admonition to give. Of course she opened it, and when she opened it, out flew all of the ills of the world. And of course she jumped back on the box to try to close it and to stop them flowing out. But she was too late. But in fact there was one thing left in the box. And those of you who know the story will know this. The one thing left remaining in the box was hope. So although I've given you quite a tough lecture at the end about the death of democracy, I hope that I've also left you with some amount of hope. And with that, I think we're open for questions.
So Barry, thank you so much. What an interesting journey. The start at unIntelligence, we went through CSI and somehow ended up back at the death of democracy in there. I know you're thoroughly passionate about some of these issues. Let me move to a couple of questions. We've got a bunch of good questions. Please do keep them coming in to us. They want you to go back to slide number 16, if you would. There were two questions about that slide in particular. The first one was, some people missed your definition of real, and you had some very good acronyms in this. Real, CSI, and ideal I thought were all terrific in there. But the question was, what was the definition of real, if you could run us through that again, because several people
I do apologize for leaving it off the slide. Realistic, as in we can actually build this thing. Extensible, as in it can grow to handle whatever needs to be handled. Actionable, that we can do things with it and it can respond to changes in the environment. And essentially labile, which means flexible. Labile also meaning that it can grow and change as necessary.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And then the other question that came up at the same time there was somebody asked if your relating thing in there meant normalized on that particular slide. So you said that the process data had to be related to things in there, and I think the question was immediately diving down into a technical detail that you may or may not have wanted to get into, but go right ahead.
Okay, so normalized, not necessarily. Normalized to me is a key part of making sure that information in this process-mediated data area is understood sufficiently to be able, and let's use the word model as well, is sufficient to make sure that we understand how it relates together. So in some cases, yes, we might want to go as far as normalized, but I'm not a normalization freak, so I don't say that everything has to be third normal form or I don't know what the higher normal forms are. But certainly some key parts of it will probably need to be normalized in order that we can be sure that what we've got in there makes logical sense. But there will certainly be pieces in there which are going to be structured in other ways, and I have nothing against star schemas, for example, in parts of this process-mediated data where they give a certain level of speed that you couldn't get in a normalized disk-based relational database.
Excellent, thank you. All right, so I'm going to go back and first of all, give us a good ACM question in here. And Barry, you may or may not want to drop into this, but ACM is all about learning and, more importantly, fostering our next group of upcoming researchers and technical professionals So the question is, I'm a PhD student majoring in computer scientist, and I'm interested in big data. So what do you think the research trends are in big data?
Yeah. Okay. So that's a tough question for me, Peter. As I'm not in the academic world, I'm not in that more research-oriented world. Let me try to answer it from my own personal experience, which to me comes back to some of the questions that I was talking about towards the end of this presentation. So yes, of course, there is some interesting work to be done in terms of how do we structure big data, how do we look at the role of the data scientist and so on and so forth. But I want to really emphasize and focus on that, those of us coming through university and doing PhDs really need to step up to the social and the real world implications of what we're doing here. I'm really concerned about that, and I don't want to beat it to death, but I think it really should be part of all research. It should be part of all the development and all of the aspects of big data that we play with here these days. I mentioned earlier, I think, that what's happening here with big data is that we're moving from a situation where we decided what data we wanted to collect and how we wanted to structure it because we knew what we wanted to do with it. And that's very much a traditional scientific method approach. And now we've moved into a world where we're using data that has been collected for other purposes, for new things that we want to do with it. And I think that means that we have to really start looking at the logical leap that we're making. So, for example, when I talked about the idea that monitoring driving behavior. So we monitor drivers' behavior for insurance purposes by looking at how the engine is performing. We look at what speed are the wheels turning, what force braking was used, did the car go around the corner on two wheels more than twice a week. All of those things are actually physical attributes of the engine and the infrastructure of the car. But we use it to then extrapolate to decisions about the person that's driving, about their attitudes, about whether we should insure them, and so on and so forth. And although in that particular instance you can say there's a probably 90-something% probability that they're correlated, there's lots of other areas where the correlation is much looser, and it needs to be thought about. So this idea of correlation and causation needs to be really deeply investigated, I believe.
Another question that we had here talked about how to separate the noise from the signal there, and I think that's one of the things that you were just hitting at, which Nate Silver, of course, hit in his book as well on that. But let me drop another one here. Again, we've just a few minutes to make sure we get as many of these questions in as we can. One questioner says, can we summarize that business unintelligence is like social business intelligence? I don't know if you have a thought on that or not. Can we summarize that business unintelligence is like social business intelligence?
Social business intelligence. I'm having to guess a little bit what the questioner means by social business intelligence. I'm sort of assuming that it has something to do with the information that we gather from Twitter, from Facebook, and so on, and then use to make decisions on the social level of interaction. I want to step a little bit beyond that limited view, if that's what the questioner's view is about. So to me, business unintelligence, let me explain the word a little bit. That's probably the easiest thing to do. And it's the background is the following. When I was writing this book, I didn't know what to call it, and I went through a lot of stuff, but everything that I came up with had already been stolen by the marketing department of some large vendor. So I was looking for, I thought about analytics, I thought about insight, I thought about lots of words. And eventually, through a devious route, I came across a reference to Bram Stoker's book where he talked about the undead. He talked about the undead as being neither living nor dead. They were just simply different. They were undead. And this thought came to me that what I wanted to talk about was something that was neither intelligence nor was it stupidity. It was unintelligence. And I wanted to bring in that thought that when we look at decision making, and I'm interested in decision making particularly in business, within the context of the social environment within the business and the psychological environment that is, if you like, within the head of the decision maker. So I wanted to bring out this idea that even though we may have all this information, even though that we may try to analyze it and we may try to understand it in the context of statistics, you mentioned Nate Silver, Peter, already, and a good guy and good stuff that he does, even though we may have all of that, even though we may have good processes where we understand that if we take people and we put them into a work group and we understand how they interact and we can do some of that adaptive process environment work that enables innovation, even then we still don't yet understand the interactions that go on between the decision makers within the business. We don't understand the more subtle drives that go on in the heads or in the hearts of the decision makers. And so most of us who've been in this business have experienced that we have been sent away to investigate and to bring back some spreadsheet or some set of slides about a set of information about why such and such is happening, only to be sent away at the end of it and said, that wasn't really what I was thinking. Maybe you could go and have another look at that data. And, what's coming up there is actually the data is being used to validate a decision that's already been made. And that decision might have been made on the basis of gut feel, or it might have been made on the basis of the fact that the person who was looking for the answer was actually stealing money from the organization and didn't want it seen. So there's a whole lot of stuff in the background there that has little or nothing to do with rationality, but has an awful lot to do with motivation, social interactions, and so on. So that's a rather long answer, and I hope I have addressed Abla's question.
We'll find out in a bit. A related question to that, too. This is the question. There was a study I read about recently that stated belief trumps knowledge. Can BI overcome this, or would it use belief before knowledge?
I'd love to get a link to that study, please, Craig. The idea, I mean, I think there's many ways of looking at this, and I've been reading a lot of stuff in the psychology area and in the sociology area as I've been researching this, and Daniel Kahneman has been doing work in it, Gerd Gigerenzer, et cetera, and I think it's a two-way path here. Yes, beliefs do drive what it is we think we know, and it sometimes takes some considerable jolt in the information that's coming towards us to move us from that comfort zone of believing that we think we know what the answer is and should be. I also do some coaching work, and it's also interesting to look at that in relationship, how we interpret what other people say and do. And so in that sense, there is a belief which drives knowledge. But I think in a business sense, we have to recognize both that happens, but also to try to help us to use the information that is at our disposal and the hugely growing amounts of information that are at our disposal in order to help us challenge some of those beliefs. And we'll find that sometimes our gut feel is right, and other times that we need to adjust.
And again, as you said, we're figuring this stuff out. So we're just about at the top of the hour, and there are a bunch of questions on jobs, career fields, how IT works in this area, and also finally, if you could sort of try to address that from your perspective. What do you see in the job market? Where do you tell these people who are interested and they want to go study this stuff further? And finally, finish us off with what did you get your PhD in? Because those are some of the questions. We've got about 10 around those.
Okay, let me answer the easy one. My PhD was in chemistry, but it's many, many years ago. I don't know that. This is a difficult one, how to guide the young folks as to where to go. I think we're in a very changing environment, both in terms of job market, in terms of the way businesses work. The old certainties to me are no longer reliable. In fact, if you go and have a look at my blog, it's on binetwork.com. If you have a look at my blog, there was a series of articles that I wrote back in February of this year, which unfortunately you may find a little bit depressing, but I came to the conclusion that the job market for the future is going to be an awful lot smaller than present. And I would love to hear some views to the contrary. But I think we're in given automation, given robotics, given big data, I think we need to really think carefully about what it is that we're going to be doing in the future. And it means changing the way we do business. It means changing the way we run our society. And I really hope that the PhD students and the other folks who are upcoming. I'm old and I won't see the end of this. Who are up and coming, take some of these thoughts on board and really look at it from the philosophical side of what we're doing here.
Well, and as you pointed out several times, particularly in the last third of the presentation, these mean a lot. You're talking about our Senate and our NSA, and you're in South Africa worried about some of these issues because they do affect things worldwide. So, Barry, we're at the end of the hour here. Again, I want to thank you for taking time. It's 7 p.m. in South Africa time, if I get that correctly, so probably time for you to knock off for the day and have a bit of the braai, something along those lines.
And a nice glass of Western Cape wine, yes.
There you go. I'd be there enjoying you if I could. Again, thank you so much for taking the time. Thanks to everybody who came on. We had a tremendous number of questions that we couldn't actually get to. Barry is a tremendously approachable fellow. He would love to hear more from you guys on this. And again, just a really, really good session. So thanks to everybody for participating. I'm really sorry we couldn't get to all the questions here. But again, reach out to us, and we'll look for you on the next ACM time. Thanks to everybody for taking the time to attend and to participate today.
Thank you.